SECfans.com, week 10, and you knew who we were going to start off with, Alabama and LSU. Want to remind Alabama fans and LSU fans, please subscribe if you haven't already. If you're with us by this point in the season, you've heard us talk a little bit and you're coming back, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you hate what we're doing, hit the subscribe button twice. See what happens. Also want to remind you, please, in the comments, let us know what your score prediction is, and y'all mix it up. Be clean, be nice, be friendly. Maybe keep the conspiracy talk to a minimum, and let's talk about the game. And yeah, Josh, we're going to get nerdy and talk about it right now. Alabama and LSU in this game, I think with the close but big win for LSU against Auburn, and obviously how they started the season with Miami, we sort of saw the momentum building for this game until the Florida loss. But then LSU surprised us again, as they always do, because the LSU people who follow this channel know we have a hard time pegging them. And it seems like the Georgia win completely erased any of the negativity surrounding the Florida loss. So let's get into this off the bat. The point spread in this game is sort of divorced from the actual statistics, and we'll probably get in the model quicker this time and discuss it. And we don't do a lot of gambling here and all that, but the point spread came out today and it was a 14-point spread. And I think if you look at the numbers, it would not necessarily indicate that. How much of the Georgia game for LSU do you think is contributing to that point spread? And are you seeing something in that point spread that tells you that maybe LSU's got a puncher's chance in this one?
I think obviously any game has to factor into the point spread. So certainly Georgia does factor in. There's an interesting thing that happened last week in that Georgia more or less thumped Florida. Now, that was a closer game than I think many would think if you just looked at the box score, if you didn't watch the game and see the flow of it. The Georgia pulled away late. Basically, Florida struggled the entire game offensively, got behind, and then the moment they were playing from behind, they got blown out pretty quick. But what I say is interesting there is you have this weird situation where Georgia pretty soundly beat Florida pretty badly, right? Florida beat LSU. LSU thumped Georgia. So there's no real clarity in those three games. And I think the Georgia game was really important because it said 27-19 LSU over Florida. At that point in time kind of looked like, well, maybe LSU isn't quite that good. Maybe what LSU has done, I think you pretty much have to concede at this point. Miami is not that good of a football team. They're not. And on this channel, I gave more credit to Miami than was due. It was kind of funny because we got railed by Miami fans. If you go back and look at the comments on our Miami LSU video, we were a lot more critical of Miami, I think, maybe than the national media was. And I think something, I'll let you verify this, but when we started talking after we did that video, the more I dug into the comments by the Miami fans and all the arguments they had, the more skeptical I'd become because I'd look into it and say, okay, well, this is a red flag. And where's this? This guy's production last year wasn't very good. And this guy was really key to their team and he's gone. And, back me up here. I mean, they're.
Yeah, if anything, the Miami fans in their discussions, and this is why we say, give us your score prediction, comment in the comment section, because there is good discussion that's had after the video. And the more you talked and the more we talked, the Miami fans, if anything, they didn't persuade us. They made us more, just like you said, more fervent in our beliefs because we did even more research. And again, first game of the season, it's hard to know. It's hard to know who's what or anything like that. But we are pretty, and we can say the same thing about Georgia. We're pretty consistent in when we say, if you lose considerable production off of a team the year before, you're going to feel it in week one. If you can lose considerable production off a team that wasn't great, you're really going to feel it.
Right. And so the thought from both of us, okay, and to be very, very clear here, LSU won that game 33-17. It's not like LSU won by 2 in overtime or anything like that. LSU won that game really soundly, but as the season's gone along, we've looked back and gone, okay, Miami, that win probably doesn't mean a whole lot. Miami was not nearly the team that some of us anticipated they'd be. We didn't think they'd be great. I think we made the comment even that we didn't think they were necessarily top 25. early in the year. But I think what it showed was that LSU was tremendously better than we expected, frankly. LSU has a better identity than we expected. I think LSU has a better running game than we expected. They're more consistent. That's shown up through the early part of the season. Southeast Louisiana, La Tech weren't pretty wins, but they were solid wins. LSU showed all the signs of being a physical pro style team. The Auburn game was a close win. I still don't quite know what to make of the Auburn game, and we may do another video this week. I think probably people are a little too critical of Auburn, honestly. Auburn lost a couple games to some good teams, and they're very inconsistent. I don't know that they're terrible. I mean, Auburn did beat Washington in the opener. Granted, now Washington probably isn't going to be considered that great of a team either. But you go all the way through down to the Florida game, and in retrospect, beating Ole Miss badly is not a major accomplishment this year. And holding.
I will say though, beating Ole Miss badly isn't a major accomplishment, but just like the Miami game, the way they handled Ole Miss in Miami shows that they're a better team than they were last year. Because I could see the last year's LSU team winning both of those games and not necessarily winning them against this year's Ole Miss team or this year's Miami team in blowout fashion.
Right. And so what I'm trying to get to with all this is I think there's a lot of LSU fans that were very frustrated that they went into the Florida game, 2 top 10 wins. They weren't ranked very high. They didn't have a lot of consideration. What a lot of people were already seeing from Miami and Auburn was that these teams were not going to finish top 10. They weren't going to finish top 15. The Florida game, that loss really changed it even further because now people say, okay, well, we're already questioning Miami and Auburn. They lose to Florida. And then when LSU turns around and beats Georgia, what that said is, that Florida game was probably a little bit more a combination of a lot of different factors than just, where LSU is as a team. And that the fact that, like you said, it's not just that LSU won those early games, other than the Auburn game, which was very close. The other 4 games early on in the season, LSU was pretty much in control of all of them. The Auburn game is a little weird in that Auburn statistically was the better team in that game. But I also think that was an Auburn team that we haven't seen since this season, that they have to have some sort of locker room problem, if not a quarterback injury issue. So the Georgia win sort of reset our thinking on it. And that's why I talked about the importance of that Florida, LSU, Georgia triangle, in that you can't draw any real conclusion from those because there's no logical A beat B who beat C.
So a couple of things on what you just said, and Alabama fans will get to your team in a minute. Spoiler: Alabama's pretty good at football. Auburn early in the season, I thought was a better football team. It's not fair to say eye test, especially early in the year, but eye test told me that they were a better football team. Plus, it was a road game at Auburn when Auburn was still undefeated in top 10. That makes things challenging. I think Alabama will find that out this Saturday. That's a completely different team than you're getting on the road or at home versus Auburn right now. In week 3, it was a completely different win against a completely different team. The consistency issue with Auburn, we saw them up versus Ole Miss, down versus Miss State. I think they got an up Auburn and still beat them. So to me, in my mind, I still give them credit for a really good win against Auburn, regardless of what happens to Auburn the rest of the way. Secondly, for the Florida game, I've got some thoughts on this, and maybe you saw some of this against Florida, in Florida against Georgia this weekend. I have a theory that Florida is actually a really good football team as long as they don't have enough slip-ups to where they're having to dig themselves out of a hole. We saw it with Kentucky and again with Georgia, and I think that's what happened with LSU, where the Florida team that LSU was playing kind of step for step with them along the way because LSU isn't really built to offensively blow teams out. Florida was hanging with Georgia for a long time, and it just kind of unraveled late. And I think Florida's a better team than they showed against Georgia. It's just that because they're so ill-equipped, especially at quarterback, to play out of a hole, it compounds the problem, their weaknesses, to a point where things are more likely to unravel, and LSU just never got them to that unravel point.
I think that's probably fair. If you look at, I think it's kind of interesting, the win probability with Florida, Georgia, LSU, Florida. At some point, we're going to probably want to do a video on this specifically. I am getting really skeptical of ESPN's win probability metric because the number of times a team is 95% chance or greater winning a game and doesn't win seems entirely too high.
I wonder what it was for Missouri, Kentucky this week.
Yeah, it's way it happens way too often. It swings way too fast. There's something weird there, and I doubt anybody's really tried to track it at a high level, but that would take me some time to figure out. But if you look at the Florida Georgia game, going into the third quarter, it was under 60% chance of Georgia winning that game. It was 59% coming out of the halftime break, and Georgia drove down the field and made it 14-20, and all of a sudden it was 80% that Georgia would win. And that's 14-20, right? I mean, it was a 6-point game. But the moment Georgia took the lead, as far as the win probability matrix was concerned, Florida was pretty much out of it. And it goes to your point. Florida is a disjointed team. I've been really critical of Franks this year. I can see where the talent is with that kid. And there's plays. There's one particular throw where he put over the middle that I thought was fantastic that led to one of their scores. But just the inconsistency with that team means it's just really hard to gauge anything against them. If they play well, and I think another thing to point out when they played Georgia versus when they played LSU was the cornerback health. When they lost that second corner in the Georgia game. I think that might be a real issue for them the whole rest of the season because they couldn't stop the passing game in the second half. LSU played a much healthier Florida team than Georgia did. So all those things sort of factored in. And then the Georgia game, though, I mean, same sort of issue when they played LSU. Georgia came out strong, kind of got behind, and it was pretty clear that Georgia had no idea what to do to play from behind. And that game got out of hand. LSU certainly won that game. I don't think it was, I've talked a lot. The Auburn LSU game was kind of a statistical anomaly that most metrics say 7 out of 8 times. With all the stats you have in that game, Auburn wins. And that's not too crazy given that they needed a long pass play at the end to win the game. Georgia was not nearly that weird. I mean, LSU won after about the first quarter, LSU was winning that game. But I don't think 36-16 is indicative of a lot. And then, you follow that after 19-3 Mississippi State. And that game's sort of its own little story because as much as on one hand, it's a big deal to hold Mississippi State to 3 points, 19-3 win looks pretty good over what seems to maybe be a good Mississippi State team. I think it's a Mississippi State team that is flawed in very specific ways offensively. But there's some concerns there because even though LSU won that game, LSU offensively was pretty bad in that game. They got outgained 260 yards to 239. So it's just really hard to look back over the course of the season. This is kind of the summation of it and say, what is LSU? And it's easy to critique us or our model or whatnot. I mean, the best we can do with a model is spit out, this is the average LSU team. But LSU varies a lot over the course of this year. And I think one of the things we're seeing from LSU, and I think they're adopting this from Coach Orgeron, they're playing with a lot of emotion. And when they've been in big games, they've played well for the most part. And when they haven't been in big games, they haven't played as well. And like you said, I think that win at Auburn was probably bigger than it seemed. But they've been able to get big plays when they need them. And in games, the La Tech game, at times Mississippi State, because Mississippi State didn't look like they were ever going to score in that football game. There wasn't really a sense of urgency. I think they're playing up and down to the competition level quite a bit. What all those things do is, in terms of computer models and metrics, and even us both objectively talking numbers and then subjectively trying to talk in terms of emotion, it's really hard to gauge because it's hard to say what LSU team you get week to week. There've been many different versions of it. There's no clear picture. There's no logic that makes sense from LSU. I think the one takeaway in this game specifically is I would be absolutely shocked if you don't see the best version of LSU coming out of a bye week and playing the number one team in the country at home in a game that they clearly would have had circled all off season. I think that you do have to view this LSU team based off the best they've played this year and kind of ignore the weirdness in between because the best version of LSU is probably what you're going to get in this game.
I think also if you look at LSU at home this year, take away the directional schools because they don't really matter. close game against Auburn on the road, loss against Florida on the road, but then drill Ole Miss, drill Georgia, drill Mississippi State all at home. And that Mississippi State game, it was 19-3, but it was an ugly game. They had some weather in that game. Mississippi State also has a very, very good defense. We saw that against A&M this weekend. But that brings me to, we talked about Florida not being able to play from behind. Is LSU kind of a similar team in that with Joe Burrow and a running game that's, frankly, you said that they're running it better than we expected, but we didn't expect a lot because we expected a good bit of drop off. Last year against Alabama, Brissett was the third string running back. Williams had a good run, which was really their. I think they had 10 points. It was 7 points in the game. Was that huge run they had? It's like a 50, 60-yarder. Brissett was the third string player in that game last year, so we didn't expect a whole lot from the running game. Are they equipped at all? Because we've seen the hot starts Alabama has. We've seen all the statistics about first half Alabama scoring is like 13th in the country overall. Stuff like that. If Alabama jumps on them early, 17-0, 14-3, something like that, is LSU equipped to come from behind, and does it change their game plan at all? Or are they who they are and they can play a four-quarter game and not fall into the trap that we've seen maybe Florida fall into?
It's hard to project because LSU really hasn't been in that situation much this year. The one instance where LSU was in a situation where they had to score was late against Florida, and they did pretty quickly turn the ball over once they were in that situation. I'm hesitant to draw too much from that. Florida has a good pass rush. I'm not sure Alabama's
and a good secondary.
Yeah, and I'm not sure Alabama's pass rush is as good as Florida's. Alabama's secondary right now is better than Florida's. It's really hard to gauge where Florida secondary really was a few weeks ago. The injuries, the injuries have stacked up for Florida. Missing a couple defensive starters is kind of making that a hard judgment call. But I don't think LSU is probably very well equipped to try to come back from a multi-score deficit in this game. If they do, they're going to have to be really true to themselves and stick to their game plan. I think when you're Alabama this year can be run on at times. We've seen that. They've kind of shored that up for the most part, but it's possible to run on them. That wasn't necessarily true. I'm sure, a couple years ago in the 2016 game, LSU had a much better rushing attack, right? And they couldn't move the ball on Alabama. And that wasn't no dig on LSU. That was just an Alabama front that is one of the best defensive fronts we've seen in college football in the past decade or a couple decades, right? That front seven was tremendously good. Doxing myself a little bit, I'm located in DC. The Washington Redskins now, I think was it 4 or 5 guys in the front seven were all front seven players from that Alabama defense. This defense is not that good. They aren't, and not every defense can be at that level. Not every running game could be as good as LSU's running game was that year either in the offensive line in the backfield. It's a little interesting to try to project. I don't think LSU's as good at running the ball as they were in 2016. I think they're probably more balanced than they were that year. I don't think Alabama is nearly as good at stopping the run, but LSU's still good at running the ball, and Alabama's still good at stopping the run. But at least I think you can run on Alabama, and we say this a lot, a really elite defense. If you get past a certain level in the college game, there's a lot of defenses in college that can get to the point where it doesn't really matter how good you are. You can't run the ball. It's just not going to happen. You have to be able to throw it. That's why throwing teams have been the teams to beat Alabama when they were really good teams. It's because it isn't just an Alabama thing. It's an elite defense thing. So, yeah, I mean, it's tough because LSU wants to stay in their game plan. They want to stay on schedule. If they get behind too much and they have to throw, I think any ability they have in the run game is going to kind of go away, and it's going to make things really inefficient.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about game plan and scheme. I saw the Alabama-Tennessee game, and backup quarterback had to come in for Tennessee, Chris, and he had some success against Alabama. And 2 plays stuck out to me. One, a I think it was a 4 or 5 wide look where the running back was out wide, lined up was it Mac Wilson was lined up over him, and it was a really deep, not even a wheel route. It was just like a really deep route from the running back, and it was a good throw. And then it was the second touchdown, I think, was a really nice, well designed play where the quarterback just dumped it in the middle of a cover two look, like just past the DB or the corner right before the safety. Guy catches it, perfect throw, drops it right in the bucket, walks into the end zone. These are two plays that I haven't necessarily seen from LSU this year. Combined, their running backs have like 9 receptions on the season, so it doesn't seem like that's a part of their offense. And wheel routes and running backs isolated against linebackers have killed Alabama this year, or it has been their one weakness. And a good surgical like quarterback that can pick apart a cover two or pick apart a too high safety look has also proven to be pretty effective. Are these things something you've seen from LSU this year, or are we getting into the area where we see what Alabama's weaknesses are and LSU may not necessarily have something that can exploit it?
I don't know that I've seen those looks specifically, and I know the plays you're talking about. One in particular, partly they got Wilson isolated on Ty Chandler, and I remember that play because I remember thinking that was one of the couple signs that Tennessee actually has some skill players kind of hanging around, Juwan Jennings and Ty Chandler. I don't know that Brosette is the guy in space that Chandler is. I think Brosette's maybe probably a better back than Chandler, but Tennessee has actually some pretty darn good skill players. It's a little tough, I think, for LSU to use their backs because they're bigger. For the most part, I don't think they're as well built for that scheme. The one thing I will say is, if it's the drive I'm thinking of, then Christ was the quarterback from Tennessee in that drive. There are some similarities in the fact that Tennessee moved the ball well with Christ. I was curious if Tennessee was going to go with Christ or Garantano. I think it's kind of a mistake still to go with Garantano, and I think last week kind of maybe exemplified that a little bit with some of their late struggles against South Carolina. They ran their offense with Chris. They didn't do anything too fancy. He doesn't have the arm Garantano has. He can't make all the throws Garantano makes. But what they were able to do was just get a guy open schematically and throw the ball to him with accuracy and on time. I think that's what Burrow's done a good job of. And we've been critical of times of Burrow. He has a low completion percentage. He has a lot of bad statistics. But I will say that he runs the offense very well. I think he gets them in the right play. He seems to understand offensive schemes. He seems to be a heady player. He seems to pretty calm and collective in my view of what he needs to do. When he turned the ball over, like in the Florida game, he did it when he was pressured, when he was forced to basically operate outside the system because he was having to play catch up. That's why I think they don't need to be in a come from behind situation. But I, especially given the bye week, I have no doubt they're going to try to mix in some rub route stuff like Tennessee did, and some things to isolate safeties and linebackers. I think one thing I will say, both teams, I think you have to be careful. LSU and Alabama, when they play smaller opponents, they tend to give up a little more points than some. And it's because both Aranda and Saban with his defensive schemes play a lot of straight man coverage. And offensive coordinators know you're going to get that Matt linebacker lined up on this running back in this play if they're in their straight defensive schemes. And so, they'll sit there and they'll know this is what the 3-4 is going to look like. They'll get a certain alignment, a certain look. They know they can run a pick. They know which guy they're going to pick on the snap. There was a play in that Tennessee game. It's the one they scored on. It was kind of funny to me because the receiver stares down Deontay Thompson, the safety, runs towards him, sort of isn't directed at him, and then leaps into the safety to knock him off balance and then score. And I remember that because it was kind of funny to me because it was such a blatant pick. But you can get away with it usually because it was in traffic. But the point is, all those schemes, they worked because they knew exactly how Alabama was going to match up in man coverage. They knew how the linebacker was going to slide out in protection. They knew that they knew the safety was going to be covering the running back coming out of the backfield. That's the kind of stuff that works when you're playing a team that's up 20 points on you, and they don't think you can win the game. Aranda and Saban in this game are not going to give you straight man coverage. They're going to drop defensive ends into coverage. They're going to do some exotic stuff with the safeties and the linebackers in coverage. To a certain extent, it can leave them exploited. You might see a big play or two come out of that. Both of them are susceptible to it. Alabama has been this year. Aranda, throughout his career, in these big games, often gives up a big play or two because when you're being that aggressive, you're not always sound if everybody isn't doing everything perfectly in the back end. But the trick is it's really hard for the offensive coordinator to predict it, to run those sort of rub route plays. And if you do that kind of stuff, with both these teams on defense are very good at, it makes the offensive coordinator's job really hard because he can have what he thinks should be a really good play call, and then he ends up seeing some sort of exotic coverage, and their quarterback throws an interception because he doesn't expect the defensive end to drop, and he expects to have this rub route open to a running back, and then all of a sudden he's throwing to a D end who's sitting in the lane, and that's not something they ever practiced or saw in film. So that's, I think, one of the big caveats I would have with offensive scheme for both teams in this game.
So let's talk a little bit about LSU's approach against this Alabama defense, and then we'll talk about Alabama's approach against the LSU defense. I've heard some kind of discussion in the ether out there about the potential for LSU to go fast in this game, and it might be there, especially since Burrow's a better running quarterback than LSU has had in the past. It kind of helps you to go fast if you can run at quarterback or if you can run at all. Talk about whether or not you think that's a good approach against this Alabama defense, and is it something? We've talked in the past about, we always go back to the Virginia Tech Clemson game a couple years ago, where if Virginia Tech played that game straight up, they were guaranteed to lose, but they're also guaranteed to keep the score respectable. Is LSU, if they play this game straight up without taking a lot of risk and maybe without changing some things and not going fast, if they come into it and say, hey, I want to shorten the game, I want to take every snap at 7 seconds on the play clock, I want to grind it out, run basically an Insminger offense, try to keep the score in the 24-point range, like 24-21, something like that, then I can live with the results because they're respectable. Or do they go just completely over the top, maybe throw in the kitchen sink at Alabama, knowing that they might maybe have a wider margin of loss if they lose the game?
I think if you're LSU, if you respect yourself, if you believe you have a good football team, then I think you want to play your offense. I don't think you want to go the high variability approach because while it can win you the game, and this is what we talked about with Virginia Tech Clemson, 80% of the time it will lose you the game. 20% of the time it will win it for you. But you do that when you're outmatched, you know you're outmatched, and you want to have a chance to win a game that you probably couldn't win otherwise. So I think maybe there's an argument that LSU should take that approach. But to say that you should take that approach, you first have to admit the fact that LSU probably isn't going to win the game playing normally. I don't know that the LSU coaching staff or fans, I don't think you'd want to say that and say that you're not going to win the game normally. And then that kind of, so I'm kind of in the air there because it's sort of a circular question. Is LSU good enough to win playing the normal offense? If so, then don't do it. But to answer that question, it's, well, what does the offense look like? And it just goes in a circle. The other side of it is whenever we talk about these high variability teams, and a lot of times people talk about aggression and how aggression's given Alabama issues. Well, the first thing I'll note is tempo really gave Kirby Smart issues more than Alabama. And when Smart left Alabama, they haven't had nearly as many problems with it. And it's been fascinating to me to watch how many issues Georgia had with LSU running tempo, because it does kind of indicate that might be a Kirby Smart problem. I think his scheme may be a little too complicated. They have a hard time calling in plays. They had to call timeouts for the defense, etc. But the teams that had real success with Alabama running tempo were teams that run tempo all year. Ole Miss, Texas A&M, Auburn, Clemson, all those big games, all those big teams, those were teams that run tempo by default. And I think they ran that offense, especially with Ole Miss and Texas A&M, kind of trying to get an edge. And it was a way to get an edge with a roster that hadn't won a lot of games, and they were very successful with it, and they built towards it. But Both those teams had a lot of ups and downs, and they were not very consistent teams running that style of offense, which is why you don't want to do that, in my opinion, if you want to win a national title in the SEC, because you're going to have an off day or two, and that's probably going to knock you out of the national title hunt. But it did mean when they played Alabama, they were very comfortable in a high scoring game, much more comfortable than Alabama was. They were comfortable taking shots constantly. They executed those plays with some level of comfort because they've been doing it against their trash opponents. And they were able to take advantage of it. But I think it's very different if you're LSU and you try to run that style of offense because it's not your comfort zone. And we saw that with Matt Canada when they tried to do a lot of motions and shifts. And I've always been very positive to what Matt Canada did at LSU and how they were able to generate offense, even though the team in many ways wasn't great. They did have a lot of procedural penalties. They had a lot of issues on that offense where they were very inconsistent, doing something they weren't comfortable with. It takes years to install an offense to a high level, and to completely change your tempo so that you're a fundamentally different offense, in 1 week or 2 weeks, even with a bye. And I know they ran tempo against Georgia, but I still think the tempo they ran against Georgia was in very limited extent. So I just don't think it's a great idea to do probably against Alabama because it's not what they're built to do. Because if you think you're going to win, then it's probably not the right decision to make anyway. It's only the decision you take. Maybe if you are down 2 or 3 scores, you start running tempo, and maybe that's a way you can run the ball a lot because you do want to keep the possessions low to increase variability. You do want to put pressure on the other offense. You want to score quickly. Well, the one way to do that kind of together is to run tempo and still run the ball. I know I'm taking a little bit of time to answer this question, but I'll give one last example with this. Florida State Clemson last week. That game ended up being a blowout, and it's kind of weird if you watched it because Clemson didn't score for a quarter. They didn't score for the last 10 minutes of the game. 25-minute period of that game, Clemson did not score, and they put up, I think it was 59 points in the game in the intervening 30 minutes. They did that because Clemson had 11 possessions in the first half. Normally, you get an LSU game or an Alabama game, usually you get 12, 10 to 12 in a game. Clemson had 11 and a half. And the reason for that was that Florida State's defense was playing really well, but that Gulf Coast offense that Taggart was running in the first half punted the ball over and over really quickly. They were running tempo and they weren't getting any yards. So it was like incomplete pass, incomplete pass, incomplete pass, punt. And they were burning, it was 60 to 90 seconds off the clock in a drive, and they'd give it right back to Clemson until Clemson started scoring. If you're LSU, basically what I'm saying is you don't want to do that. If that's not a thing you're very good at, then all of a sudden what you're going to do is give Alabama a bunch of possessions, and then you can end up in a 20-point hole. And if that happens, this game you're in a really, really bad position to win this game and not get blown out.
Looking at this game, I think it's fair. I think the criticisms of Alabama's schedule, it's not Alabama's fault that their schedule is this poor, but it's hard to argue against the notion that Alabama has played a horrible schedule to date, and LSU's probably played the toughest schedule, on average this year. How much of that is a disadvantage for Alabama coming into a game where you literally have all the things they haven't seen this year? Elite pass defense, on the road hostile environment against a top 5 team. How much of that is a disadvantage for Alabama, or does it matter because they're beating teams to a standard where whether they were good or not, they're so much farther ahead of what looks like the rest of the pack that they can apply that same formula to an LSU and it won't matter? Is that a thing with Alabama this year? Are they so good, which kind of tips your hand on your pick? Or are all of these things combined, the pass defense, the hostile environment that Tua really hasn't seen this year, and the fact that it's just an all-around good team that can meet them athlete for athlete, is that something that might shock them into getting them off schedule in the first quarter or half?
It has to have an effect, right? I mean, playing a defense that's this much of an improvement over anything Alabama's really faced at this point in the passing game is a big effect. And we've talked about this a lot with Alabama. Missouri is a pretty darn good defense. Texas A&M is a pretty darn good defense. They're not much more than that, but they're pretty darn good. And why are they not more than that? It's because their pass defenses are really bad. Texas A&M's pass defense
Allowed Miss State to complete passes.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald, I think had ended up with 11 yards per attempt in the Texas A&M game. I mean, if Fitzgerald's throwing for 11 yards per attempt, I'll give the guy credit. He played his best game year to date because he's been missing wide open throws all year. It didn't matter who the defense was, but that says something about Texas A&M's pass defense. So I definitely think when that gets better, it has to have some effect. Alabama's numbers against Missouri weren't fantastic. They still scored 39 points. And I will say they pulled the plug early, and that's a little deceptive because early, I think it was the third quarter when Tua got hurt. So he only played about a half in that game. But Tua has not looked the same. I think it's clearly, I will say his plant leg seems to be injured. So it's really weird for me to gauge him because he's left-handed, but it's the injured knee is the knee that he's planning on when he throws. I don't think he's wanting to put weight down on his leg. So when he throws it, it's sailing because he's not wanting to bear down. I say all that because you don't want to be floating passes against this LSU secondary. If you have some errant throws or some overthrown throws, especially over the middle, that's going to turn into interceptions. Tua still has, and we talked about this when he was a freshman, and he's gotten a lot better at it, obviously, not throwing interceptions, but he still has that bug in him where he wants to make a play every play. He doesn't want to throw the ball away. And when you're playing an elite pass defense, there's going to be times when there's nowhere to throw the ball against LSU. There's no safe place to throw the ball. Question is, how does Tua react to it? Is he actually smart enough to throw the ball away? Does he get frustrated if he goes 2 series without anywhere to dump the ball off and force something? I think he's capable of doing it. We don't know the answer to any of these questions. And, it's going to be interesting to see how he responds in this road environment. I think you have to be really cautious in saying, oh, well, he's going to fold. He's never seen this much pressure before. There's no more pressure than coming in at halftime in the national championship game against, what to that point was probably the top team in the country in Georgia and winning that game, scoring 26 points in a half. That's about as much pressure as you could get. So I think the answer to all this is just kind of a big question mark. But I do think the flip side is I don't think you're going to shut them down completely because it's easy to say the schedule is really bad, but a lot of teams in the SEC have played bad schedules and still nobody opened with, 3 in a row, 50-point games. No one ever has averaged over 50 points a game as late in the year as Alabama is, or even come close to it, even though a lot of teams have played really weak schedules. And there were periods in the 90s where the SEC was a pass-happy conference, and nobody had these kind of numbers ever. So I think you have to give credit for that. And then you also have to, if you've watched Alabama, then it's not just like they were scoring in their opening drives in a lot of these games. It was a matter of, does it take them 3 plays or 5, right? It was 16 yards per play that they were averaging, and you could have their production and they would still score a touchdown every drive. So it's really, I think you're going to slow them down, but does it slowing them down even equate to really reducing their scoring? That's a hard question to answer because they really could. I mean, again, you could throw away in a lot of these games, you could throw away the second down on every drive, and Alabama still would have put up 40 or 50 points. It's like they were playing against air at times, and it's just really hard to project that.
We don't do a lot of feeling stuff on here, a lot of gut stuff, a lot of emotional stuff. But the flip side of this, I'm curious what you think if we're putting something positive in the Alabama ledger, not like they need it. Alabama, because they haven't played a great schedule, they haven't had a lot of opportunities to really mentally get up for a game. Could this maybe be a problem for LSU that Alabama's coming in as a team that has been not a sleeping giant, they're killing everybody, but a team that knows, if a team knows they can beat you going in, they prepare and they approach the game completely different versus a team that's really up for the game. Is that a potential problem for LSU coming into this game that maybe Alabama will be more motivated given how good LSU has been this year than otherwise they would have been?
I think so. One of the interesting things is people talk about, how many top 10 teams we've beaten or this fact or the other fact. We talk a lot about how that doesn't really matter to us because we're predictive. And what we mean by that is win-loss records don't win games. Being motivated, being on a good winning streak, 2013 Auburn at the end of the season when They kind of went on their little run. They played like a little bit of a different team there at the end. That stuff does matter. I think having motivation of playing for a title matters. But for the most part, if that's the case, you're going to play like the team you are. And one thing I will say is, LSU, if they played top 10 teams, if they played instead of Miami and Auburn, if they played two directional schools, they'd essentially be the same football team. The difference is they have a higher ranking, and they're currently a heavy playoff contender slash playoff favorite. So that does give Alabama more motivation or more incentive than if they weren't. I think there's a double-edged sword to Alabama's schedule. It's really easy on one hand to say the schedule's really been really easy, and you can't, and to really rag them for it. One, as we were saying, it's a little weird to say that when they've won every game they've played by four touchdowns or more. But also, on one hand, Alabama's a bit untested. Now, untested does not mean bad. Untested means question mark. It means we don't know what Tua is going to do when he places an elite pass defense. It doesn't mean that it's going to make him be bad against it. We just don't know. But the other side to it is Alabama has not been played 4 quarters and been beaten up for 4 quarters at any point this year. Alabama hasn't really had to be emotionally up for any game. And I think there is sort of a certain amount of, energy, if you will, that a team has over the course of the season. You can only get up for a couple games a year, realistically. It's a big advantage when you'd see like Boise State play Michigan State or Oregon, that if that was the only game they really had to play that really mattered, it was easy for them to get way up in that game and come out amped. And the other team knows it's just another week. We got another game we can lose next week. And you've got to approach things differently that way. Well, Alabama's schedule being so easy, and to a certain degree, I think may help them because the Alabama team, for weeks now has been hearing about LSU and hearing about LSU. They've kind of been able to just kind of go through the motions in every one of these games, compete at a high level, win easily, get the starters out. And now this team is going to come into this and say, we're ready to actually play 4 quarters of football. I haven't gotten the chance to play in the 4th quarter yet if you're Tua Tagovailoa. And there's probably a certain amount of excitement to know, this is the game I'm actually going to be able to go out there and do my thing. And it matter and it show up and it not just be easy. Competitors want that. So I think it is an advantage actually to Alabama that LSU is highly ranked, that Alabama hasn't played anybody. It kind of helps them in a weird way in this game because of the motivational factor.
Why don't you get into the model? Tell us what the model says and tell us what you think about the score in terms of like, is the model on the right track? You don't have to give your score prediction yet, but like, is the model on the right track relative to the numbers, or is the model missing something?
So, getting into the model, the first thing we usually talk about is our intermediate statistics, and that's a percent of opponent averages allowed. So one of the things our model calculates to start with is, we look at your opponents, we look at how your opponents did against everybody else versus how they did against you, just to peg you completely relationally versus, looking totally at the strength of your opponents. How good is your defense as a neutral statistic? So Alabama allows 79% of opponent rush averages per carry. LSU allows 86%. 79% is a great number. It's not elite. We want to see something below 75% to be elite. 86% by LSU is actually it's a good number. A good to great run defense. Good to great, still really good, but it's not elite. Neither one of these run defenses is as good as they were. That's not the 2011 unit for either team. Pass defense, I find this a little interesting. LSU and Alabama, their opponent average is almost exactly the same, 7.54 yards per attempt each. Alabama average allows 5.8, LSU allows 5.9. So Alabama's pass defense slightly higher rated, 77% of opponent averages. LSU is allowing 78. I think a lot of people going in this matchup would just normally assume that LSU has the better pass defense. I think LSU has the better secondary than Alabama. LSU secondary is extremely good. Delbert and Greedy Williams are great players. But Alabama has a better pass rush than LSU right now, and Alabama's secondary is quite good. Deontay Thompson is an All-American level player. I don't know that, Alabama doesn't have a corner as good as Greedy Williams. I think the corners are all solid. I don't think personally the injury to Diggs has been a huge blow to Alabama's secondary. And I think Surtain has played an extremely high level. But, they're not as great at the corner position, but they've made up for it by the fact that they can rush the passer a lot better. So it kind of balances out. Alabama a little bit better against the run. Both pass defenses very good. The real difference here is that Alabama's offense statistically is just phenomenal. Averaging 13 yards per attempt is insane. 5.2 yards per carry too, which is 25th in the country. And that, one thing I dug into a little bit is Alabama has shut this down really early in most games because they've been up so fast. Damian Harris has not played a lot of snaps. And so I just looked at first quarter averages to try to figure out, usually teams' defenses are actually really up for the game in the first quarter. Most teams don't score a lot at the beginning of the game. They score late when defenses are tired. But in the first quarter, Alabama is averaging 6.3 yards per carry. That's first quarter only stats compared to first quarter only stats for other teams. Alabama is actually 14th in the country in per carry averages. Alabama's has 14.8 yards per attempt in the first quarter too. They're allowing 3.35 yards per carry and 5.67. So basically, yards per attempt. So basically, Alabama's numbers here: 5.2 yards per carry, 13 yards per attempt. You can basically add a yard or two, a yard and a half to both of those numbers in the first quarter, and subtract about a half yard from the defensive averages if you're looking at first quarter numbers. That's how much their blowouts have impacted, if you will, their statistics. It's really top 15 rush offense and the number one pass offense by far. LSU's offense is not bad, especially running game, 4.23 yards per carry. That's, I think, 68th nationally. Not a great number, but serviceable. 6.8 yards per attempt, though, is not a good number. 6.8 yards per attempt. We say 6.5 yards per attempt is what you need to be competent in the passing game. LSU, on average, is just barely competent. Statistically, it is. So you take all that, run it through. Alabama is expected to average 7.1 yards per play. That's not crazy. That's well within their statistical range. It's lower than their average in most games. LSU is expected to average 4.1 yards per play. Something I often like to talk about is what does that sort of relate to in other games. 4.1 yards per play for LSU. That would be the second lowest total they've had all year. Higher by about 0.8 of a yard from Ole Miss, but about 0.7 between Auburn. So halfway between your yardage per play between Auburn and Mississippi State, excuse me. And Alabama at 7.1 yards per play is about what they averaged against Ole Miss. And yeah, it's just kind of a matter of how good their offense is at that's where it comes to. So given those two numbers, as far as the model is concerned, projecting against past results, it has this game Alabama 50, LSU 23. And so those numbers really comes down to the fact that Alabama is scoring 40 to 50 points in every game and stopping when they want to. And the fact that LSU, they hit 36 against Georgia. They hit 45 against Ole Miss. But, it's saying basically that LSU is going to score as much or maybe a touch more than they did against Auburn, which seems like a reasonable number. It's just saying that number, the Auburn scoring production isn't going to be nearly enough to keep pace with what Alabama is able to do offensively.
Oh, something I wonder. So because Alabama has played such poor opponents and their numbers are so unbelievably high, it has the potential to throw off a model. It hasn't shown that this year. Our model's been picking Alabama about 54 points per game, every game we've done for them. What do you think about the notion that a team that has such outlying high, good statistical numbers, and it's based on facing poor competition, and I know our model is not really, it doesn't really care if you place poor or great competition. It's an average against their best game, or their average game. Is there a potential for Alabama's numbers to tumble considerably in a yards per play average or a scoring average because they face a team that can slow them down a little bit? So meaning the offense operates at such a high level, but if you slow them down a little bit out of their norm, do these numbers drop dramatically because they're off schedule? And does it take being perfectly on schedule to hit all these kind of gateways to get to that 54-point average that they're normally at?
It's a weird question and it's an interesting question. I think one of the notable things is if you were to go through, and we kind of work with the assumption that usually scoring tracks pretty heavily with yards per play. It's not perfect, but we've got to have something to sort of plot against, and that's usually a pretty good metric. Texas A&M was actually one of Alabama's higher yardage games. It was the third highest per play average game Alabama had, behind Louisiana Lafayette and Arkansas. They averaged more yards per play against A&M than they did against Ole Miss, but they didn't score nearly as much. Part of that was due to the fact they shut it down late in the half against Ole Miss. That definitely dragged the numbers down. But part of it sort of shows that if you, and the same thing again, I will say, the Missouri game, they averaged a higher per play average against Missouri than they did Tennessee. I think if you disrupt Alabama, you can keep them from scoring some. That's sort of a sign that, like you said, slowing them down isn't maybe even the right word. I mean, just getting negative plays and sacks, getting them off schedule, not letting them do exactly what they want to do when they want to do it. I was critical way back when in 2013 with Jameis Winston, because they played an extremely weak schedule in 2013, and that was a historically good offense. But Winston was essentially able to throw to the guy he wanted to throw to whenever he wanted to throw it. Same thing happened a couple weeks ago when Clemson played NC State. If you go back and watch that game, NC State gave them their first read every play. They weren't able to generate any pressure on Lawrence, and the corners had to play 8 to 10 yards cushions. I was really disturbed, by the way, about their pass defense, which ended up being justified, I think, last week when they got torched by Syracuse. The point is, if you play a really good offense or an offense with a good quarterback and you don't disrupt his timing, and there's two ways to do it. You can get pressure on the quarterback, or you can have good corners like LSU does, jam the receivers, get them off their routes, disrupt the timing. That offense is going to destroy you because the quarterback gets to throw on rhythm when he wants to throw. If you're able to disrupt that timing, which is something to a certain extent A&M was able to do and Missouri was able to do, not give Tua his first read every play, they were able to stop Alabama's offense some. And they certainly weren't able to stop it every time. Again, Missouri game is really pretty deceptive, actually, because Alabama essentially only played a half of offense and then just shut it down. And they also lost 2 or 3 starting receivers in that game. So, but I do think there's some impotence to the fact that you're able to slow down. And that said, if you're cool with it, because I've talked for a bit, but I want to bring up just a little couple nuggets to sort of point out how maybe historic or out of whack Alabama's scoring offense is historically. So I finally found somewhere where I could get statistics on points per drive. If I had my way, a lot of the stuff I would talk about would be in not a per play basis, but actually a lot of it would be a per possession basis, because possessions, play to play, there's different types of offenses, and you can even actually kind of mess with that. But per possession, I think, is the truest form of how effective you are in scoring. Again, the example of Florida State Clemson, that game was a blowout because Clemson had the ball, I think it was 16 or 17 times in that game. They really, for a lot of that game, weren't very effective. Alabama on a per drive basis is insane. Alabama averages 4.7 points per possession. A field goal and a half every time they have the ball. To put that in historical context, I found statistics going back to 2007. As far as I could see, only one team has ever, well, there's 2 teams. There's, counting this year, there's now 3 teams, but only one team before this year had ever crossed 4 points per possession. That was Florida State in 2013, was 4.02 points per possession. This year, Oklahoma is currently at 4.1, and Alabama is at 4.7. So in a per possession basis, Alabama is right now the highest scoring offense by like a point a drive of any team in recent college football memory. And, Alabama allows, and it's easy to say their defense has given up points, but again, talking about things that are a little deceptive, LSU's actually given up 1.3 points per possession defensively. They've played shorter games than Alabama because their style of offense has given up less possessions. Alabama is allowing fewer points per drive, 0.98 points per drive. So when LSU's opponents have had the ball, they score an average of 1.3 points. Alabama score average less than a point. So if Alabama's opponents has the ball 10 times, they're going to score 10 points. And LSU's, they'll score 13. So with Alabama, the gain on that essentially is every time both sides change possession, Alabama's average basically 3.71 differential. So if I have the ball and then you have the ball and we reset, generally I'll score 3.7 points more than you will. LSU, their differential is 0.93, which is 25th in the country. Alabama is number one, by the way, by 50% better than anybody else in the country. And Central Florida is number 2 in this category. The upshot of all that is basically, if you were to, the schedules are not even. So that's a big caveat here. But looking at what happens when LSU has the ball, how much they allow, when Alabama has the ball, how much they allow, that statistic points to the fact that every possession, every series of possessions, Alabama has essentially a 2.7 point edge on LSU. That, in terms of what Alabama gains and allows and LSU gains and allows, Alabama will outscore LSU every possession 2.7 points. Essentially, every possession is a field goal. So if you project that over the course of a game, so let's say 12 possessions, what is that? A field goal over 12 possessions is 36 points. Our model is at 27. And so, even more specifically, we said it's about a 2.7 point differential. 2.7 points over 10 possessions is 27 points. So what our model is essentially telling you is exactly what that statistic says. Every possession, Alabama has a 2.7 point edge over LSU. It's saying that there's probably going to be 10 to 11 possessions in the game. That adds up to a 27 point differential, which is exactly what our model is seeing. And a 27 point differential, they're saying LSU is going to get just as many points as they did against Auburn. It's just that Alabama scores that much more. 27 point differential puts it at 50. So that's kind of putting Alabama's numbers in historical context and explaining where, from the computer's perspective, that number comes from and how it ends up being so dramatic.
I do think it's interesting. I wonder, it's so hard when these schedules have been so different to know really, kind of like we were going in the Georgia Florida game last week and we said Georgia and Florida haven't played a lot of the same teams. We had the LSU data point and we didn't have a Kentucky data point yet. We still don't. It's hard. And if I'm an LSU fan right now, I'm thinking, okay, I know you say your model doesn't care how good or how bad the opponents are, but right now I'm seeing 50 to 23 in your model, and I'm thinking this is because, and these points per drive are because LSU's played some defenses Alabama hasn't. Alabama's not played, anybody worth a crap, and LSU's played a handful of teams that are good. The flip side of Alabama playing a lot of bad defenses is they've also played a lot of bad offenses, which has given them the ball a lot. But I don't know that LSU's offense is very good. And LSU fans, don't at me. I mean, statistically, your offense is below average. And your defense is just that good, and it's made up for it. It showed in the Florida game. Giving my pick now because I think we've over-talked this a good bit, and it's time to wrap it up. I like 20 for LSU, not quite the 23 that the model's predicting. And I like 43 for Alabama. 43 to 20. I think LSU finds a way to shorten the game early to make it a little bit more interesting than maybe the final score will indicate. So kind of a flip from what we're used to seeing where Alabama jumps out all over somebody and it's 28 to nothing in the first quarter. I think it's the flip of that, and we'll see Tua in the fourth quarter for the first time, and it takes the full game to get there. I think this is the best defense Alabama's going to see this year because I think LSU's defense is better than Clemson if Alabama played Clemson in the playoffs. I don't think Georgia's defense is very good at all, at least not in terms of matchup. The problem is I don't love LSU's offense, and I think it's going to give Alabama possessions, and I think the worst thing you can do against this Alabama team is have the 3 and outs. And everybody's talking about the LSU secondary versus Tua in this Alabama offensive attack. But Alabama's got really good NFL quality wide receivers and a tight end. And I don't know that Smith's going to play. I don't know where his injury situation is, but they've still got Waddle. They've still got Devontae Smith, not Irv Smith. He's healthy, obviously. They can still flex a tight end out there in a three wide receiver set to make up for it. I think this LSU secondary is actually going to get tested more by the Alabama wide receivers than the other way around. And it kind of shows in the numbers, 77%, 78%. I think Alabama secondary is better than they're getting credit for. LSU scores, though. I think they throw the kitchen sink at Alabama. I don't think they play scared, super trying to shorten the game or anything like that. I just don't think offensively they have the horses. They're going to really have to shock Tua, or Tua's going to have to be injured for this to be an issue. I know White's not playing in the first half. I hate that. I think that the hit was clean. I think the call was terrible. Yes, it was within the rules. They need to change the rule. White should be playing in this game, but I don't think it would ultimately change the outcome materially. Tell me what you got on the score.
So my thinking is not too different from yours. I have this 41-17. I'm with you. I don't think 50 is a realistic number. Alabama's hit 50 several times. I just don't see that happening in this game. It's going to be too much disruption. But like you said, even saying 41 sounds like a lot. But that's 7 touchdowns in the game. That's holding them. That's keeping Alabama from scoring 5 or 6 times, and they're still going to get 41. It's so hard to keep Alabama this year from scoring 40 to 50 points every game. It's what Kirk Herbstreit said preseason, right? If Tua started for Alabama, they'd score 40 to 50. That's what we've seen. There's one, historically, there's really one offense that's done this, and people talk about the 2005 Rose Bowl game, right? It's USC and Texas. And everybody, I think a lot of times talks about that game because USC was this unanimous number 1 team. They had all this star power. Something everybody missed going into that game. Outside one game in week 2 against Ohio, a top 4 Ohio State team where Texas won 25-22. Every other game that season, Texas scored between 40 and 70 points. They always scored 40 to 70. And they got in that game against number 1 USC. And what did they do? They scored 41 points. If you've got an offense that's that good, that can score 50 points every game consistently, that never has an off game, it's extremely hard to keep them from scoring at least towards the floor of what they've been scoring in their other games, which for Alabama, just like Texas then, it's in the 40s.
And their floor is artificial because they're shutting it down in literally the second quarter. Even when Tua's in later than like against Tennessee, he's in later. They're not running the full offense. Once they get up, like you said in another video, once they get up 20-ish, they start slowing down a little bit, and then they put Jalen in without fail when it's 28 to 30 point lead. So you're saying 41 points, and people are going to be like, well, Alabama averages 54, so that's not that much less than the average. But really, in a full 4-quarter game, Alabama would probably, it's not ridiculous to say they'd be averaging in the 80s. Is that fair?
Well, in the Tennessee game and in the Ole Miss game, they were on pace for 100 points going into the second quarter. By early second quarter, when they started to slow down, they were on pace for 100 points. Alabama would have scored 100 points in Ole Miss if they wanted to. They absolutely were able to do that. So 54 points, even that's really deceptive. Here's another statistic I dug up on it because I have to look up. There's a lot of these I find because I have to look up these statistics when I'm doing the model. You know how many passes Alabama's thrown in the fourth quarter this year? 15 total. That's 8 games they've thrown 15 passes. That's 129th in the country. Georgia Tech, who runs the triple option, has thrown 33 passes in the fourth quarter. Okay, the only team they're ahead of is another triple option team in Georgia Southern. So Alabama doesn't throw as many fourth quarter passes as Army. So the amount that they've shut it down is insane. It completely skews the statistic. I think 41-17 is reasonable. It's a 14.5 point spread. I saw this factoid right before we started the broadcast. This is the worst line that LSU's had since 1999. They haven't been more than a 2-touchdown dog. The line just moved to 14.5 since 1999, 20 years. And it's really just due to what Alabama is, how good they are. I brought up the Texas game to give an example. I think, like the model's saying they're going to score just like they did against Auburn. They're going to put points up. It's just, as far as we know, it doesn't matter that Alabama is going to be able to score 40 points in every game this year. It's just hard as heck to beat a team like that. And it may be that that's not the case. I think they're going to be ready to play. I think that it may be that the secondary can create some turnovers. There's a little bit to be said that it's like watching Michael Jordan play in high school, the way Alabama's been against their schedule. You can if you hit a 3-pointer against every team you play on every possession, how do you know what it looks like when you play a college team? Because at some point, what our computer is throwing up its hands and going, I don't know what bad looks like. There is no example of bad. There's no example of slowdown. Maybe it happens, but I don't even know how that starts. But that's kind of what we're dealing with, and it's just a matter of that 17 to 23 points is a really good number against Alabama. That's more than LSU scored in a few years. It just may not matter. And like you said, and I'll give you one final statistic before I know we probably want to wrap this up because we've gone long. I think it's fine given the stakes of the game, but the running game from LSU, if it were better, I would have more faith because I think Alabama can be run on. No back at LSU, no lead back from LSU has averaged under 5 yards per carry since Stevan Ridley in 2010. So Nick Brissett now, we're 8 years in. This is the lowest per carry average that any LSU lead back has had. He's averaging 4.3 yards per carry. So, it's not a great number. And because of that, because they can't run the ball that well, it's hard to see them sustaining drives. I think, given the situation, they're going to be able to score points because, like you said, they'll throw the kitchen sink. That's actually, statistically, there's not a suggestion they should score that much. But we're giving credit for the fact that we think they're going to be able to find a way to do it. It's just, how do you win a game against a team that can score 40 points in the SEC with a really good defense? It's hard to fathom. In the same way USC wasn't able to do it against Texas, I think it's too tall a task for LSU or any team to be able to do it this year.
There's a couple of things that I would say that are in LSU's favor that may turn this a little bit. I still don't think it wins it for them, but it may close that gap. One is turnovers, which are highly variable. And Tua hasn't thrown an interception this year, but he hasn't faced a secondary like this year. And he has shown that he likes to wait forever for things to develop, which could lead to fumbles. Turnovers are a thing that we're not considering here. Special teams are a thing we're not considering here. And, Alabama's punting situation is downright scary. Their kicking situation is not great. And I do want to go back to the thing that I said before about getting Alabama off schedule. If Alabama at a 8 instead of a 10 disproportionately drops their numbers to a 5, which could happen because they may rely on being that perfect to be able to score, then this thing changes entirely. If a couple of those deep shots turn into 3-and-outs, then this thing changes entirely because LSU can shorten the game and can get it into the fourth quarter. But I'm going to flip this around and let you end it on this. Because this is what LSU fans are going to say. We've heard the generational team thing about Alabama before. We've seen the Week 10, Week 12 comparisons to say which NFL team could Alabama beat, only to see them lose to a Clemson or only to see them lose to an Auburn. I'm going to go 30 seconds on why this year it's actually true and it's different from those other years.
Before I start, one thing I will say is LSU scoring in the model 23 points. It does consider, to a certain extent, turnovers and special teams to the extent that it's a trend. That is a part of why the model thinks they get 23 points and not less. So
but it's a trend. I'm talking about variability and turnovers, right? So not things that are plottable.
Right. So it could be a lot more than that or a lot less. So it's just saying, on average, what they generate should turn into those points. I want to throw that out there because otherwise we'll get 30,000 comments. We've seen that happen before. You guys don't even ignore, you don't even consider whether somebody can throw a football. It's kind of crazy sometimes. All right. the short answer to this, it's the reason I spent some time talking about points per drive. Alabama's had some teams that had the word generational thrown out. A couple years ago, we were doing this channel. We talked about Alabama in 2016. And our continual statement then was we felt like the defense was generationally good in 2016. But we were both very early on critical of Jalen Hurts and saying Alabama's offense was very vulnerable when they played at a high end defense, and that the defense was going, the offensive inability to translate points was going to catch up to them. We thought LSU was going to be a close scoring game, and that a low scoring game from Alabama. We were right generationally that the defense was good, but we were also right that the offense couldn't keep pace. At no point has Alabama had the offensive production they have this year. At no point have they been this consistent at scoring. Their numbers haven't been anywhere close to this. And you can talk about all those other teams, but 40, they're setting offensive records game after game. It's not the same team those were. I'm just going to turn around and point right back to statistics, because I can say it all I want, but that doesn't have any meaning, and I can say whatever I want, and it has no basis. But I can tell you Alabama has the highest scoring per drive offense in the past at least 11 years. And Alabama is second in the country in points allowed per drive to combine with that offense. Those two factors put together make them extremely difficult. I won't say impossible to beat, but you would need to be a generational team to beat them more than likely. So unless that changes, which again, we haven't seen them play a secondary like this, we don't know how it translates. No one can beat a healthy Alabama with those kinds of numbers, because their worst day is going to be better than anything you can put up against that defense.
All right, y'all, another super long one. We tend to do this for big games, and this game deserved a little air to breathe, a little bit more discussion than normal. I'm not mad about it, so why don't we keep the discussion going in the comments? Remember to subscribe. Remember to tell us where we got it wrong. LSU fans, you kind of got that trump card right now, because we haven't been right on your team when we picked him to win or when we picked him to lose. So you're probably feeling a little better about the score than normal, than us normally picking against you. So
hey, now that we did actually get the Mississippi State game right. I will say that 26-12, the model of Mississippi State. So it did come around a couple weeks ago, I think, on LSU.
So Josh is right, but he's been wrong a lot about LSU. So y'all let us know in the comments where we're wrong. Sorry we ran so long, but not really sorry. It's a good discussion. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.